Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review The Room 2003, I believe, is this film. Going into this movie, really, there are kind of utterly kind of polarizing kind of reactions to this film. A lot of people say that this film is a masterpiece, and some eventually will call it a disaster. Hence, why eventually later on, they ended up doing this movie, ended up being called The Disaster Artist, which was to actually go and kind of follow the ways of which that this movie was to originally be put together. And weirdly enough, I ended up seeing The Disaster Artist before I ended up seeing this movie because I was like, okay, like maybe this will eventually get me into wanting to eventually finally find and watch The Room. Also, the main interest of me finally going and wanting to sit down and watch this movie was simply I've heard it through a number of big, gigantic, massive, juicy, succulent, huge, enormous YouTubers that are to eventually at some point either review this movie or talk about it. Like, we've had at some point PewDiePie reviewing this film, and like it gets to a point of him being fairly rare to ever actually review a film. Like, I've seen his Joker review, I've seen him talk about The Room before, and so like, but I've also had Markiplier eventually reference The Room and talk about it while he was actually playing this game called The Room, and he was like, "Yeah, I haven't seen the movie The Room yet, but and we also have it to where Markiplier is to supposedly pronounce room in a very specific way, which like it doesn't really matter how you pronounce it as long as you say the word, but." People were to often make fun of him for pronouncing it. Who cares? He ended up saying the word. Um, I think also Jacksepticeye, I think at one point had mentioned about The Room, but not quite sure about that one. But anyways, so going into this movie, I know like a lot of points in time, like people will say that this is kind of wide spectrum of film. A lot of people may hate it or whichever. I am going to go in the route of kind of like reviewing it in only a way of which that I can. Like, because like I want to have like really gone into this and right out of the gate like I felt that I knew what I was getting into, so I came in here with very like low expectations, and like I was actually seemingly surprised about this film in a positive way. There were certain line deliveries within this movie where I was like, okay, that's a really interesting approach to line delivery, no matter how kind of odd or strange it might sound. Like, I still got some enjoyment out of these line deliveries within this movie. I think that it's interesting that this movie is to mainly focus on this affair like story. And also, I would end up calling the sex scenes very much sensual magic of sorts. So, and also, Lisa isn't a very attractive woman. Let's also say that. But not only that, but there's also some attractive women upon this cast, anyways, regardless, and which have you. But when really just looking at it, there is to only be one woman throughout this film that is to consistently take her clothes off, as well as the men. So, bravo to both Johnny, Lisa, and Mark for having to consistently disrobe throughout this film because there is numerous sex scenes that are to be done very sensually and very interestingly. Because it seems that Lisa just cannot eventually take her hands off this man named Mark. Really, I think a lot of people will eventually probably come out of this movie remembering certain specific lines like, "Oh, hi, Mark," or I did not hit her, I did not." Um, there is also to be this really like interesting line that Johnny is to deliver like right at this like stair railing um, before this movie ends the way of which that it does. So like I don't know, there was something about me that liked bits and pieces of the dialogue, the way that they kind of like talk about these certain characters, how they mentioned at some points when they don't want to go into very specifics about things, they end up saying words like, "Oh, well, it's just complicated. I can't go into it." And then eventually it's like, "No, like I just want specifics." And it's like, "No, it's complicated." And then they end up having to drop it. Or like Johnny is to mention that like some part of his business is to be confidential, and so like it seems like we have in this movie them talking about it's complicated, and so it seemed like a barrage of kind of different people like kept on going about that, and I just kind of thought that that was interesting, again in a positive way. um to just kind of have these characters who are to supposedly be these kinds of people, but like don't know much further background beyond like what they're given to be written. So yeah, so like it's also interesting to kind of see Lisa's line delivery when she is to be uh, outside of either Johnny or Mark, where eventually Lisa is to like mention that she's changed, or that eventually she finds Johnny's character to be boring, and eventually we'll expand upon that when we get into spoilers. So I don't know. There was something about this film that, like, I came in here with very low expectations, and it like raised my expectations. So I would say overall that this is like a movie into like realize how low you're gonna go into it, and then just be like surprised by otherwise like some kind of scenes of sorts, or just kind of interesting dialogue. But maybe I might focus not too much on the dialogue, but yeah, so I just thought that this movie was interesting. That may not be good or bad, but like I would just say that this movie has to be said as an interesting film, which I feel like interesting is probably in a very middle of the road kind of thing, but it's either like you have heard about this movie and want to go and see it regardless, or you want to come in here to maybe just be like, okay, what the heck did this person say? Like, like what was he talking about? Like this is the room. He does realize that, right? Like, because I know that there's that people too. It's like I just came in here with a certain kind of mindset, and so that's how like I would say that if anything, I would probably say uh, this movie would probably be graded higher than maybe Interest, just because of its kind of story, and plus it's plenty of sex scenes that are to just be like, okay, all right. We get some grinding going on and some butt movement and whatever. But anyway, so let's go out of our way to go into that coveted double five timed territory, because it's that customary time yet again to go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So by no stretch of imagination am I going to say that I'm going to talk about this movie in perfection, that I'm going to go through every single scene. Because it seems like a lot of scenes in this movie don't really connect to one another. So I could probably just start to bang out most of the scenes, and just kind of focus on certain things, but have certain side stuff to be possibly at some part of the story. But so if you have never seen this before, you can go into an app called Fox HD Movies and check this out for absolutely free. Because I'm going to say that before we get into spoilers. And so, like, that's the only real app that I could really legitimately find this. to actually be able to watch it for the first time because I've never actually seen it because of how like difficult it was to eventually be able to find this thing with the exclusion of actually going ahead and purchasing it and whichever. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. Uh, so the very beginning of this, we have Johnny coming home to eventually get this red dress for Lisa. Supposedly Johnny or Tommy Wiseau is to be this banker who is seemingly doing well at his job, that possibly he's going to get a promotion. But then eventually, once Johnny is to go to his job, he ends up not getting this promotion, and he kind of feels uh, that his job is just kind of like effing him over, or just kind of using him in some kind of parts of this job. So I just was like, okay, that's kind of interesting. So, but yeah, so Johnny is to go and get his woman this red dress. He ends up opening up the door and is like, "Oh, hey, babe." Because it seems like he just has that introduction thing for every single person that he's to meet. It's always, "Oh, hi, Mark," or it's, "Oh, hi, Denny," or, "Oh, hi, whoever." And I just thought that was kind of interesting. So Lisa ends up going and getting this red dress, and so what ends up happening is that seemingly Denny is to go and mix it up with both Lisa and Johnny, and it seems that eventually Lisa and Johnny want their own private time because Lisa, I guess, wants to show her appreciation to Johnny for getting her this new dress. To basically just say, like, oh, well, he's going to give her this brand new dress for her to just take it off. So all of a sudden, we have Johnny and Lisa who are all of a sudden having a pillow fight. And then Denny comes in and starts pillow fighting as well. And then again, both Johnny and Lisa have to retell Denny, like, oh, don't you have studying to do? Don't you have something that you can be doing? And so Denny goes off and is to go and do what he is to do. And then, of course, right after that, we end up having both Johnny and Lisa going at it. Like, very interesting song that is to be playing in the background. Like, there's something about this music that, like, I kind of have questions of my enjoyment about it, where it's just I'm enjoying the song, but I just don't quite know why. But I don't know. I guess I could say that I just, in the positive of things, I liked the music. Uh, so Johnny and Lisa are going at it, and so like we can't say much about that because heaven forbid YouTube likes to not let people go into specifics about things because like immediately like things will get claimed, things will get taken down, any number of things. So I guess we just have to fast forward a little bit. So so pushing on. So eventually what is to happen is that Lisa is to go off and to talk to her mother, who is Claudette, and so there's a compile or combination of dialogue that these two characters, both Lisa and Claudette, are to have with one another. And so I think I think I'm gonna all like smash them or mush them all up together, because like I think I can connect all these pieces and it won't hugely affect the story. So Lisa is to talk to her mother, and Lisa has a real hesitation about going and marrying Johnny because I guess they've been together for 7 years, and or like I think that they're going to get married, or it seems like they have been married. Like I'm assessing that they are going to get married because 7 years, but they haven't got married just kind of confused me a little bit. So, but yeah, so Lisa is to mention that she doesn't want to marry Johnny, And so Claudette is like, well, like, why aren't you going to marry Johnny? Like, if anything, like, he'll take care of you. Like, he's bought you a new home. He'll, he'll make you financially secure. Like, why aren't you marrying, like, Johnny? And Lisa's like, well, like, financial stability isn't all of what it's to be cracked up for anymore. Like, I'm hugely paraphrasing this movie. I'm not going to go into perfect line to line delivery, so if people are expecting that, go ahead into some other review to get a perfect delivery of every single line. Because maybe somebody knows this movie by heart because they've seen it thousands of times, because there's that person too. So, so eventually we also have in this movie that Claudette is to mention to Lisa that Claudette is to eventually find out that she's dying, that she is to supposedly have cancer. And I'm like, oh, that's too bad. But, like, I have to also kind of question the line delivery. But I'm like, meh, I think that that's kind of like an interesting way to deliver that kind of line, as well as any number of this line delivery is just kind of interesting. So, so what ends up happening is that Lisa is to seemingly be thrusted into the arms of another man called Mark. Mark. I'm sorry, I said that incorrectly. So, uh, Mark is to seemingly be Lisa's boy toy, but it really seems that Lisa is just fallen head over heels for Mark, and Lisa is to like just say how like she is just so consumed with Mark to where reasonably she's like calling him at all hours, like saying like, hey, can we go again, can I be with you again, can I like could we continue to go at it. And so every single time Mark is to one reason or another just think that he's going to do some kind of little task for Lisa, all of a sudden it ends up with Lisa going and disrobing either herself or Mark. And Lisa is to consistently tell Mark that, oh, this is going to be the last time. Like, believe me, this is going to be the last time. And then eventually they just keep on doing it to where, like, it gets so much so that they're even doing it, like, almost in front of other people, or, like, things are starting to slip that Lisa is to eventually be with Mark, much more so than Johnny, to where Johnny is at some point uh, going and saying like, okay, like me and Lisa just haven't been like together that often. So let's go and cover some side stuff. So so eventually we also have Denny. Denny is to be mixing it up with a drug dealer, and so supposedly on this rooftop we have Denny who is to be going and I guess doing something with drugs. And all of a sudden, we end up having both Mark and Johnny rushing in to go and grab this thug and to turn him into the police. And so all of a sudden, both Lisa and Claudette are now to be yelling at Denny. Like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing with your life? Like, are you on drugs? And all kinds of things. They're kind of ridiculing Denny for the mistake that he had done. And, like, it kind of doesn't really seem like these characters knew it at all what was really going on. But it seems that they obviously knew that this was some kind of drug dealer of sorts. But, like, I'm like, okay, so, like, they're eventually, like, getting the knowledge of this stuff, I guess, after the fact. I don't know. But anyways, so eventually Johnny and Mark get up there, and so Johnny is to eventually go and try to comfort Denny as he's being kind of ridiculed by Claudette. And so, like, we have that that moment. We also seemingly have plenty of moments when these guys are to kind of toss the football around. We also have a moment uh, where there's to be this guy named Mike and his girlfriend that are supposedly studying, but then they're doing a lot more than studying. And all of a sudden, Lisa and Claudette are to come home to eventually see these two doing a little bit more than studying. And so Mike later on ends up telling Johnny about this story where Mike had to come back for his underwear, and Claudette ended up spotting Mike coming back for his underwear, and Johnny's just like, well, hey, like that stuff, like that happens. It's life. So eventually we have a part in this movie where eventually Johnny is to uh, supposedly, I guess, not be promoted for his job, but Lisa is to get drunk with Johnny, and eventually Lisa is to mention to everyone that supposedly Johnny had hit her, but like Johnny is to refute or to just like disagree and to say, I did not hit her. And so that all of a sudden leads him to go onto the rooftop and go and chuck the water bottle, and is to all of a sudden see Mark, who evidently Mark is having women troubles. And so it kind of feels like both of these people are almost kind of in the same boat, both Johnny and Mark. So Mark is to mention that like there's kind of a combination of things kind of going on here, and that's my confusion about this movie, because it seems that both Mark is to eventually talk to Johnny about his girl problems, but then he is to also go to this guy who is this psychologist that is to be, I guess, their friend, and talk about women also. So it kind of feels like some of this dialogue like comes back around, and like that's at some points in time where I have to kind of question what people say at some points in this movie. But yeah, so uh, Johnny and Mark are talking about their girlfriend, or Mark's girlfriend problems. Well, technically one and the same, but Johnny doesn't know that. So Mark is to mention that he is kind of going after a woman that is to seemingly be married or seemingly going to get married, and so Johnny's like, well, okay, like what's the real problem here? So eventually, like Mark is talking about this dialogue where uh, he is to just kind of be uh, like maybe upset with this woman that he is to be involved with, because like he thinks that he may be getting tricked or maybe getting played or something like that, and he just doesn't like it, but like he just can't stop. um and so I thought that that dialogue was kind of interesting there, but then eventually when Mark is to go back to the psychologist and talk about this uh like this relationship problem, we end up having Mark telling this psychologist that like supposedly he thinks that some women are to be like good, bad, or like evil, and that uh, eventually, like I think Mark is just so like seduced by Lisa that like he has like become just so like blind about everything else, or he's not like thinking about anything else but this woman and how much more he can be with her, and he's not realizing how it might hurt any other people or any other person. And eventually we also have Johnny who I'm talking to this psychologist, and is to uh like talk about things, and this psychologist is to kind of mention that things are complicated, and that this psychologist maybe can't really give Johnny the answers that he needs, when Johnny is to just kind of be contemplating his relationship with Lisa, and so on and so forth. So there is to also be this one moment where Denny is to come to Johnny while they're tossing the pigskin around, and Denny is to mention uh, that it seems that more and more when Denny is to spend time with Lisa, it seems that Denny is to seemingly be in love with Lisa, and Johnny is to mention it's like, well, Denny, it's like it's okay that both you and her love one another, because like if everybody loved everyone, like the world would be a better place. And so Johnny is to mention to Denny, it's like, well, it's okay that you have these feelings, and Lisa is going to always love you like a friend, and like that's it. And it seems like Denny is to like I would probably be confused if I was to be given this kind of speech also. Just be like should Denny act on his feelings? Will Lisa reciprocate these feelings? Like that seems such like a weird thing to just kind of tiptoe around about or whichever, to just be like uh but anyways, like we at some points in time, like we end up having Denny when they're kind of smacking pillows around. Denny is to mention that he loves to go and watch both Johnny and Lisa, and I'm like, okay, that seems like a kind of a interesting line delivery, which honestly just comes off as creepy. But like, hey, like, just some of the line delivery, I guess, just kind of in some ways just kind of seems like off at some points. But I think the best line delivery is when Johnny is to go off to this kind of convenience store or this store, and when Johnny is to immediately come to the store, we have this clerk who's like, "Oh, Johnny, didn't even see you there." And Johnny is to ask for his things, and like this woman is to say, "Oh, you're my favorite customer." And so Johnny is like, "Oh, hey, dog," and then he ends up leaving. Like that's probably gonna be the most interesting kind of line delivery and exchange in this movie, where he is to go to this store to eventually talk to this clerk. And anyways, pushing on. So I'm not the best with dialogue. We'll admit that right now. Um, so we have Lisa who is going to her best friend, which is Michelle, and like start to talk about what's going on. Like at first, both Lisa and Michelle are to talk about that she really does love Mark and is growing disinterested with Johnny, and so eventually, when Johnny does come home, uh, both Lisa and Michelle are to say that this is like a secret between one another. And Johnny's like, well, what secret? Like, you need to tell me, because I'm your husband, and so on and so forth. So eventually, Johnny is to get so paranoid that he ends up going and getting a tape recorder to record every single conversation that is to seemingly go out through this entire home place establishment. And I'm like, okay, so like this tape recorder must be able to like record for a very long time, or maybe we're just like not seeing the tapes being flipped over and whichever, but either way. So yeah, so eventually, like Lisa and Michelle are going and having further dialogue somewhere down the road, because eventually Mark is to try and help Lisa with some kind of last minute party favors, I guess, for Johnny's birthday. And so eventually, what ends up happening is Mark is to help Lisa with this party. And then all of a sudden, like, Lisa is throwing herself at Mark. And then all of a sudden, Michelle ends up kind of just opening the door because Lisa is to say that it's unlocked, to realize that Mark still isn't technically clothed yet, and has his like zipper undone. So Michelle is kind of like going like, "Oh, well, I guess like you guys are really getting hot and heavy." But it seems that Michelle is keeping the secret, but also Michelle and some of the party goers are to eventually slowly but surely hear that Lisa is starting to eventually be much more interested in Mark, even so to where both Lisa and Mark are dancing with one another. And so eventually it comes to the point of eventually people figuring out that both Mark and Lisa are seemingly having an affair. And so they eventually go and they grab Lisa and they tell her, it's like, you know what this is going to do to like all of us? Like, not to mention Johnny, like it's going to just destroy him, but like it's also going to affect all of us because we're all your friends. And so like we have the moment where Lisa is to eventually go at some point in this movie and again talk to her mother about her relationship with Mark, and she ends up saying like, well, like, you know what, like, can I change? Can I be a different person? Can I just change my mind about eventually wanting to be with someone? And like I think Lisa uses that a lot, but um, like I can understand that, but it just also seems like, well, you can change, but you also have to kind of like to start anew, you have to go like back a little bit and complete and just kind of finish off what you had already been with to go and like it's basically like, how can you not like just think that eventually Johnny will get the hint and like you can just go off with Mark without any real word between the two of you? But anyways, so what ends up happening is Johnny is to start to see that Mark and Lisa are spending too much time with one another. And so eventually Johnny is to just get like kind of annoyed with Mark spending like seemingly too much time dancing with his wife. And so then eventually we have Johnny pulling Mark away from Lisa and fighting it out. And so eventually this all comes to a head where Lisa is to still not really tell Johnny that she's having an affair with him. Johnny has to kind of sneakingly figure it out himself because uh like Johnny is to try to make amends with Mark and to shake his hand, and then eventually Johnny is to uh after this whole party is to be over, after they consistently transition to being outside, to being inside, to being outside again, and Lisa is to consistently throw herself at Mark while everyone is to be outside, and Mark is to just be like, really, right now, like there's plenty of people that are just outside, they can come in at any moment, and Lisa just wants the thrill of it all. So uh really she wants people to know, like she like, and that's the interesting thing about this kind of line of dialogue, to where eventually someone does come in and be like, oh hey, yeah, so like this isn't right. So eventually the party's to be over, so Lisa is to go into her room, Johnny is to go into the bathroom and kind of hear like some kind of things of conversation that Lisa is to have. So Lisa is going and calling Mark and wanting to just desperately get another moment with Mark, where Lisa's just to say, like, you know what, like, I think it's time for me to finally leave Johnny. And Mark, like, I'm gonna come to you. And Mark is just like, well, yeah, uh, like I'm really tired of Johnny. Like, come to me. Like, I want your body, kind of thing. So Lisa is to eventually just finish her phone call, and Johnny is like, well, aha, like I'm gonna catch you in the act now because now I have the tape of your whole conversation because I heard little bits and little things, but I didn't get the gist of this whole conversation. So now I've tape recorded this, and now I can hear the whole conversation. And so Lee says to finally break it to Johnny that she's leaving him for Mark. And so Johnny is just so upset and just so just uh like betrayed by Lisa that like eventually his anger escalates. And I think it's really interesting where like how Johnny is going and destroying everything in this scene here where we end up seeing Johnny just thrashing through this place that he's at, just chucking this TV out the window, going and taking all these shells out of this dresser and tossing it over, and like taking everything off the bed and chucking it onto the floor, and then just kind of laying onto the mattress. And eventually, all this is to lead to eventually having Johnny uh, being very emotional at this moment and going and deciding to end his own life by shooting himself in the mouth. And so we end up kind of seeing him thrust back. And so both Lisa and Mark are to see Johnny's dead body. And so all of a sudden, after seeing Johnny end himself, Mark is to have nothing more to do with Lisa, and he ends up calling her a tramp, just like Johnny technically did. And like Mark wants no longer anything to do with Lisa, and like basically forcing Lisa to live a life on her own. Even though Lisa, all that she's ever wanted is Mark, Mark has no interest in her any longer. So, uh, so eventually, the last thing that we end up really seeing is to have Denny come in, and now Denny is trying to mourn the loss of Johnny, and like really, I think that's the last thing that we actually see here is just kind of the death of Johnny, sadly. So in between all the SEX kind of moments, of course, between both Mark and Lisa or Lisa and Johnny. So yeah, with that said, hopefully that most of this movie is to be covered in a very like rushed kind of fashion. I do realize that, and it's also not in the perfect fashion either. But like I reviewed The Room. That seems interesting, or that just kind of is like okay. I never thought that I'd review The Room, but it's reviewed now. I guess it's done now. So eventually, people will have their opinions about this movie. Uh, People will love the movie. People will hate it. People will say like, "Why did I even review this?" Like really, I just like so many people have talked about this movie at some point in time. We've had other kinds of movies who end up bringing up this film, and so on and so forth. So I thought it was finally like the time to actually watch The Room and finally just be able to just like okay, like there's something interesting about this film. It may be in a positive way or a weird way, but still like there was something about this that I just eventually found it intriguing. So with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.